Hi, everyone. This is an overview of Chapter 6, and Chapter 6 is about emotions, which, as we go through this chapter, you'll see are very useful for humans. I don't know if you've ever imagined a world in which we didn't have emotions, but emotions, when you stop and think about it, are very helpful. In fact, we often use lay terms such as trusting your gut or listening to your heart, ideas such as that to really denote the idea that we're talking about how we feel, because emotions are how we feel. And we recognize that having feelings is actually a good thing. In fact, there's a Katy Perry song with Pharrell, I believe it is, was out. I heard it the summer 2019, 2018. Yeah, summer of 2018 in Iceland, um, or actually summer 2017, sorry, in Iceland. And the title or the words are something about, don't be afraid to catch feelings. And really, again, denoting this idea that we we shouldn't be afraid to have feelings, that emotions are a good thing. And as we go through this chapter, you'll see that there are theorists who believe that emotions enabled humans in many ways to not only be able to survive, but to be able to form communities in ways that we might not have been able to if we didn't have emotions. So take a look here at what we think about as emotions. These are typically brief, specific responses to social environments. And so these responses can be both psychological, how we think and how we process the social environments around us, but also physiological. I mean, consider how we if we're scared, we may feel our pulses quicken or our hearts beat a little bit more quickly. If we're nervous, maybe we sweat a little bit. Our emotions are often tied to how we feel or what our bodies do physiologically, as well as just the thought process that goes into understanding the social environment around us and then attaching a feeling or an emotion to that social environment. There's a clip here. I won't show it to you. Please watch it on your own time. But this clip is about some of the research that's being done. And it's actually research that's quite, um, it's been done for some period of time now, and they're quite close to being able to mass market robots. And I'm sure some of you, well, I'm guessing some of you, I don't know if all of you know this, but there was a cartoon in the 1960s, and it was called The Jetsons. And in The Jetsons, there was Rosie, and she was a housekeeper robot who, she was a housekeeper. She did things around the house. Apparently, we will be able at some point to be able to purchase a robot that is a housekeeper. Or if more recently you saw the movie called I, Robot with Will Smith. Again, the idea that robots in the future will do many of the things that currently humans do for us. Whether or not that's a good thing, I leave that up to you to consider. Um, but some of you may already be using robots. There's it's the robo, it's the vacuum cleaner thing that essentially is a robot. You can set the times and the days that you want this little robo vacuum to run around your house, and you don't have to really think about it. So after you watch the video, I want you to consider whether or not you'd want one of these robots for your own child, and whether or not and why you would want one for your child or why you wouldn't want one for your child, and what you think of the technology. Um, there are, since Darwin's days, thoughts about how emotions enabled humans to, as I said earlier, not only survive, but also to be able to uh, form the types of communities that we see today on such a large scale. And so when we think about Darwin, we typically think about Darwin's survival of the fittest idea. But he also posited the notion that emotions are biologically based in humans, and that over time we adapted our behaviors to promote not only our survival but also reproduction. And so if you think about how caring about somebody, whether it's a child or it is a partner really does enable us to form a very tight bond with those person or persons, which then, of course, would enable survival, but also reproduction, because as a species, we would not have um, survived if we had not reproduced in the ways that we did. And think about how emotions then tie us to members of a group that we typically call a family, and how because the children in that family are typically the products of the reproduction of that couple, um, we're more likely to see parents caring a great deal for their children than if these are children that have no biological connection. Um, Also, evolutionary approach focuses on how our facial expressions, the way that we breathe, how we even voice certain emotions, um, should be cross-culturally universal, meaning that a laugh should sound pretty similar no matter where in the world you are, or that being scared, the facial expression of being scared, we should see that around the world as a fairly universal expression, or surprise, or anger, etc. And I want you to think about how, well, the Olympics won't be this year, but whenever you see an Olympic athlete or any athlete do well, win a race or make a goal or etc. So many athletes, male and female, doesn't matter. They raise their hands overhead and let out a yell. And that's something that we see in more indigenous populations that don't have a lot of exposure to Western societies as well. One thing I do want to point out here is that emotions typically are brief, maybe a few seconds or minutes, maybe even a few hours, like if it's at a birthday party and you're happy during that whole time that your birthday party is occurring. But moods typically last days or even months. So, for example, some people today are diagnosed with chronic depression or chronic anxiety. These are moods that for them last days or even months. Um, so let's see. Again, really quickly looking at these faces here, I want you to think about what does this face say? Well, um, maybe it says one thing to you, but another thing to somebody else. But essentially, this face is supposed to show or connote guilt. This face connoting sadness. This face connoting gratitude, like, oh, thank you. This one supposedly connotes um, uh, distaste or dislike. This one, of course, being scared. Now, cross culturally, if those were different people from various countries, Darwin and other evolutionary theorists would argue that we would essentially see the same thing across cultures in terms of sadness and surprise and gratitude, etc. Um, let's see. One thing that we do know from studying primates, because they are very close to us as humans, is that our anger very closely resembles that of primates. And so when playing, it looks as though chimpanzees often have a relaxed, open mouth display that, for the most part, looks like human laughter. Looks like they're laughing just like we do. Um, and the human embarrassment seems to resemble the same type of expressions that we see on the face of social mammals as well. Um, there is some thinking that facial expressions may also be innate, meaning that these are the way that we show expressions are born in us. They're part of our DNA. Because there is some research that does show that blind and sighted athletes have very similar facial expressions after winning a competition. So even though blind athletes who've been blind since birth um, have never seen others' facial expressions, they often exhibit the same sorts of financial expressions or facial expressions as do other athletes that are sighted, athletes that can see. So I want you to take a look at this. Can we tell from this woman's nonverbal language what she's trying to convey. I've asked this in classes, and students will say, she's interested, or she's flirting, or she's just being kind. Um, a lot of how we interact with others has to do with how well we're able to interpret their emotions, their facial expressions, their body language, even, and their use of space. But a lot of people would say it looks like she's flirting. I'll let you take a look at these smiles and try to determine which one you think is fake on your own. That's in the slide. Um, but I do want to focus some time on the idea of um, what role does emotion play in creating or promoting commitment to others? And there are two ideas here. One is that the expression of certain emotions signals our commitment to others. Okay, so I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm pretty good at being able to decipher bullshit. And it's taken me many, many years to gauge when I think somebody is not being sincere and is only trying to get on my good side, perhaps to be able to request something. Um, and and there may be some of you also who are pretty good at this. But what do we look for when we're trying to gauge how sincere someone is? We probably look at their eyes, and we look whether to see whether their eyes meet ours or whether they're darting around. We also typically will look to see their body language. Do they seem tense? Do they seem relaxed? We may look also at their facial expressions. There's so much that goes into deciphering social interactions, and being able to decipher emotions is a big part of it. Um, the other idea is that emotions can also motivate us to put aside our own self-interest and act in ways that um, prioritize the needs or the welfare of others. And so if you're a parent, and I know that several of you are, you understand this point about emotions. If you care about a child, you will very likely put aside your own needs and desires because your child needs or wants something else. So for those of you with young children, you know that you may want to sleep in on the weekends, but you don't. You don't because your child is up and needs your attention. Or if you have a partner, a spouse, your feeling, your emotion, your love for that person also may motivate you to put aside some of your own self-interest if it means that this other person's welfare will benefit from your doing that. And so you may not want to go to a family function, for example, but because you love your partner, you go to these family functions because you know it's important to your partner. And so in that way, emotions are motivating us to put aside our own self-interest, because our own self-interest might be, well, I don't want to go to that family gathering, so I'm just going to sit here and read my book, or I'm going to go do something on my own. But because you care about that person and it's important to that person that you attend this family event, you go. Let's see. Um, well, now, of course, with this coronavirus pandemic, we cannot, we're not able to touch people in the ways that we might be used to. That is, even includes a handshake or a hug, or even just sitting close to someone. But there is plenty of research that touch can be quite therapeutic for people. And if you've ever, suffered the loss of a loved one, or have, had a great heartbreak or something, that giving a hug to someone, or just sitting next to someone and holding a person's hand, can be quite comforting. And so for us as humans, it seems that touch is something that's very important as well in helping to establish the emotions that we begin to feel for someone. And certainly touching, and going beyond touch to actually having sex, is something that does tend to promote a commitment to another person as well when we think about romantic partners. There's a video here, and I'd like you to watch it on your own time, but it is about how mimicry and emotion go hand in hand. And what you'll see in the video is that if someone mimics us as we're talking to that person, smiles when we smile, nods when we nod, even tilts the head when we tilt our heads, raises eyebrows when we do, etc. When someone does that, we tend to come away from that person feeling good about that interaction. Someone who doesn't do that, we often come away from that interaction not feeling very positively toward that person. So take a look at that video and you'll see what I mean in terms of how it's highlighted that people, um, depending upon how they interact with us, and if they imitate us, we may like them more or less. Here, this is a discussion about how in any group that we're in, whether it's a work group, whether it's our family group, it's our extended family or quote biological family or the family of creation or procreation or our friendship group or a tennis club or a soccer club that we belong to, we all belong to different groups. And within each of those groups, we do have a status, that is a position within that group. So think about your family. If you are the oldest child in your family, then you have a status whereby certain expectations are attached to that status. So people in your family, if you're the oldest, may expect you to be the problem solver, the one who takes charge, etc. Maybe your status in the family is the youngest person. And so you, as the youngest child, are perhaps maybe not expected to be quite as responsible as others or to not take as much of a lead in certain areas of family get togethers. If at work you're the supervisor, again, that's a status when there are certain expectations for how you're supposed to act within that status. And of course, emotions are attached, we attach emotions as well to people depending upon their status in the group. And so the thing about emotions is that we also can, of course, depending upon someone's status within the group, we can become angry or even develop some animosity towards somebody in our group that has a lot of social power. And so it often is that the higher the status and the more power someone has within a social group, that person can actually also be the target of emotions such as anger or envy or animosity because of that person's status and power within the group. And of course, depending upon a person's status, we may also feel differently about that person's statements. So, one great example of this is what we see in commercials. In commercials, often, there's somebody who's dressed like a doctor, which typically means wearing a white coat and a stethoscope, who says, oh, 9 out of 10 dentists prefer this or recommend this, or a doctor who's saying, hey, my patients, when they have high blood pressure, I recommend they take this supplement. And so if we view that person's status as one of authority, we may feel quite positively about what that person is recommending. On the other hand, if they got some, Sancha off the street who said, hey, whenever my family members are experiencing this issue, I recommend they take this product. Many people would look at that in such a negative light and think, I'm not going to pay attention to Sancha. She doesn't have any authority here. And so, again, knowing a person's status, knowing their power may influence us in terms of how we feel even about the message that they are giving. Also, I want us to recognize that when we think about emotions, even the way that we think about emotions is influenced by our perception of the world around us. And so here are a few examples that are common. For example, we say, when someone is sad, we say, oh, she's feeling blue. Or we say, oh, I was seeing red to connote this idea that we were angry. Or if somebody's perpetually happy, we say, oh, that person sees the world through rose-colored glasses. So it's that idea that we have of attaching what we see in the social world around us to emotions. We try to explain our emotions through the things that we see in our social environments. Also, um, we, as humans, we take what we're currently feeling, the emotions that we currently feel, and we use those emotions then to make these much broader judgments about the world around us. And so, a couple of ideas here. One is called the broaden and build hypothesis. And this is the idea that positive emotions broaden our thoughts and actions, and typically enable us or promote or encourage us to help other people to build social resources. So here's an example of that. If you generally believe that most people are capable of doing good things, then you're probably one of those individuals who's much more likely to believe that if you, for example, volunteer at a homeless shelter or at a food bank or a soup kitchen, whereby people who are less fortunate than yourself are being helped, um, that positive feeling that you have about most people being good people will promote or enable or propel you toward volunteering at that soup kitchen, at that homeless shelter, etc., because you truly believe that by doing that, you're helping to build the social resources that will enable people to get back on their feet. And so you believe that by broadening your positive emotions to other aspects around you, to other social environments around you, you are helping people. And you're building the social resources that enable people to be better, to become better, to be safer, etc. The social intuitionist model of moral judgment is one that I think I see more often than the broaden and build, but admittedly, I think we see them both. But the social intuitionist model is this idea that when we see something, we experience something, we go into a social environment, we have very quick emotional reactions to these events. And we then rely on reason, that is, we convince ourselves that our judgment is the right one. So perfect example of this, because I'm certain it happens on a very frequent basis. um, let's say you're going into a 7-Eleven, you're on your way to work, you stop at a 7-Eleven to grab a quick cup of coffee and maybe a granola bar or something to eat on the way, and as you get out of your car you notice there's a homeless person sitting there. If you are like many people, you will have a quick emotional reaction to that homeless person sitting there with the sign asking for money. Um, Whether it's positive or negative, you're going to have a quick emotional response to that. Then, based upon your response to that, let's say it's positive, you will then arrive at a judgment of right or wrong. And so if you think positively and you think, well, geez, this person is a little less um, fortunate than I am, I'm going to get a cup of coffee and a pastry on the way to work. It's not going to hurt me to give this person $1. You're probably going to give that person $1, and you're going to rely on some sort of moral reasoning as to why that's a good idea to give the person $1. On the other hand, let's say someone else arrives at an emotional response upon seeing that person asking for money and thinks, I hate it when people do that. I hate that, people asking for money. This person then might begin to arrive at some reasonings, some reasoned judgment as to why that's the appropriate response, the negative response. Things such as, well, I work hard, I'm on my way to work. Why should I give this person $1 when I'm going to work? And that's $1 I could spend on the coffee or on for gas or whatever it might be. You will walk away from that emotional response feeling that you're completely correct in how you feel and what you do as a result of how you feel. Um, this, I think, is something that happens to all of us on a daily basis, if not, once or twice a day on a frequent basis throughout our day. We come into contact with the social environment and we make a very quick we have a very quick emotional reaction to that social environment. And then we may rationalize so that the judgment that we have seems completely appropriate to have that either positive or negative emotional reaction. Um, and let's see. There's a clip here about moral dilemmas. And again, I'd like you to watch that clip on your own time. And um, it's a clip about moral dilemmas, and it's called Trolleyology. It's very well known in social psychology, but it really does highlight how we make moral decisions. We are not all guided by the same principles when we're making moral decisions. Is one thing that for sure we should consider. And so to go back then to this idea of moral decisions and moral judgments, moral foundations theory argues that there are these five universal moral domains in which we have specific emotions that then guide our moral judgments. And so, for example, some people are very focused on care. How do I care for people? Whereas other people may be much more focused on, well, how do I avoid harming people? Because if you care for people, then you're going to be much more willing to help others because you care for them. If your focus is on harm and not causing harm to others, then you might be much less likely to help in certain social environments because in your idea, in your head, you don't want to harm that person by helping that person. On the other hand, if you're more focused on fairness, then for you, as you make moral decisions, you'll be much more focused on does what you are choosing to do seem fair in light of all of the circumstances that you see, or if you are more focused on cheating, and cheating is bad, evil, and wrong, even if something seems fair, but it's cheating, and or stealing, cheating is another way of stealing, then that may seem wrong to you. So here's an example of that. Let's say that you are working at a grocery store, and as you're putting stock on the shelves, you see a woman come in. She's got a large overcoat on, which seems a little weird to you because it's warm out that day. And so out of the corner of your eye, you notice her take a package of bologna and cheese. And so your job as a store employee is to report stealing, which is, cheating the store. If you're focused on fairness, though, what you might do, especially if you see two young children walking with this woman, or if she's holding a child, you might think to yourself, well, if your focus is fairness, this person obviously is hungry. She's trying to feed herself and her young child. I don't know her circumstances. Therefore, I'm just going to look the other way because it seems equitable for everyone to have something to eat. And if this is the only way she can get it, I'm not going to stand in the way of that. Someone who is very focused on cheating and stealing are wrong, terrible, and evil, of course, would be far more likely to report this woman because she's trying to cheat the store out of the money it deserves or it is owed for the products that she's taking. And so again, in some people's minds, not reporting her seems the right thing to do. In other people's minds, reporting her seems the right thing to do. And both sets of people could come up with very reasoned judgments about why they are correct. Okay, so as you go through and you read that part of the text, you'll see that you probably can figure out where you are on these moral domains in terms of what's important to you when you're making moral decisions. Because we all have to make moral decisions at some time or another. Maybe not every day, but all of us do have to make moral decisions from time to time. All right, so then this last part is just really quick here. Just thinking about what makes us happy. We hear all the time in pop culture, you can't buy happiness, or money can't buy happiness, or love makes us happy, or what all of these things about happiness. And it turns out that there are people who study happiness, who study this emotion. It turns out to be quite interesting to social psychologists. One thing that social psychologists do say, though, is that humans are pretty bad at what they call affective forecasting, meaning that humans are pretty bad at predicting how we will feel in the future. So, for example, when I was a kid, it was very common for young people to say, I was a kid and my older brothers and sisters were, teens and early 20s. And people used to commonly say, well, I'd rather die young than get old, because old people look so unhappy and I don't want to be unhappy. I'd rather die young than grow old. In fact, there were some songs of the time in the late 60s, early 70s where the whole idea was, hey, I don't care if I die young. I just want to be happy and live to the fullest right now. And if I'd rather die than be an old person. But it turns out that if you ask most older people, and by the way, many of those rockers are now old people in their 70s and still touring, they're pretty damn happy to be alive still. And as an older person as well, I'm pretty darn happy to be older. Although when I was 20, 22, I too thought, well, geez, I don't know if I even want to get old. Old people, they just don't look all that happy. But I have to say, I was pretty darn bad at predicting how happy I might be at 55 plus. I'm actually really happy, and I would not have predicted that when I was 20, 22. So, we're pretty bad at affective forecasting, it seems. But I also want to point you to some ideas about um, what, how much happiness or how much money is really needed for happiness. And there's some research cited in your text that shows that money, increasing levels of money or increasing income, uh, the more our income increases up to about $75,000 a year, the happier we get with it with each incremental increase. So every $10,000, we get happier and happier until about $75,000. And then, according to the research, even if you're making 100,000, you're not typically much happier than you were making 75. Now, I know that many of you live in California, and so that might not be true for you. 100,000 maybe would make a huge difference because then you'd be able to buy a house perhaps, or live in a different area, etc. But also, um, want you to consider that typically it seems that people are happier in countries where individual rights and economic opportunities are available. And there's a link there for the happiest countries in the world. This was from 2019. Forbes magazine publishes every year the happiest countries in the world. And heads up here, the United States is never in the top 10, never. And so I want you to ponder on your own why you think that might be. And then I also included a link here, an Icelandic woman who tells Americans what she thinks about living here and being an American. And she's pretty straightforward in her opinion of us. And I'm not sure that she's wrong. I think she might actually be pretty right. I leave that for you to consider for yourself. And then this is a brief clip here about some things you can do to be happier. There's a social psychologist who's done a lot of research in this area. And so just as you watch the clip, think about which of these things do you already do, or which of these things could you maybe do more of to be happier, even though maybe you're not going to be making more money. So this is chapter 6, the chapter on emotions. And with that, I will say until the next chapter, adios, as we say in Spanish, or goodbye in English.